This video is about Bentham, Mill, and the philosophic radicals in the 1800s. Philosophic radicalism refers to a series of writings surrounding the work of Bentham and Mill that were considered very progressive for the time. Among these platforms would have been access to birth control, prison reform and death penalty, labor unions, women's voting, education, usury. You also would have seen writing for the abolition of slavery, which was occurring in various forms during the writing of Bentham and especially Mill. So we'll compare the philosophic radicals to a group of people that we call the socialist utopians. Each emerged kind of in the early 1800s, both progressive groups. The socialist utopians generally conceived of capitalism's failure to provide for the poor and wanted to create economies with worker-owned means of production. So basically, they wanted to break away and start their own communities with new economic systems that varied from worker ownership to kind of more communal living. The philosophical radicals, on the other hand, like Bentham and Mill, in general wanted to make reforms to the existing societal structure rather than kind of restart and rebuild their own society. So the philosophic radicals want to reduce the social importance of the church and promote the economically progressive virtues that we listed on the previous page. So we won't spend too much time on the socialist utopians, but basically what we want to take away from this group is that socialism refers as an economic theory to a system in which workers own the means of production. So generally speaking, in socialism, markets still exist. We have private property, but the workers are the owners of the firms rather than in capitalism, we often think economically of firms as being the owners of workers. Workers sell their labor power to firms, and in some cases, they're required to do so in order to survive. Communism, on the other hand, refers to a system in which production decisions and profits are centralized to one decision maker, usually a government. The idea is that if they're altruistic, they'll make decisions and distribute the resources socially optimally. So there's a big difference between socialism and communism as economic theories, and the difference primarily refers to the ownership of the means of production. And again, in socialism, you have worker ownership of the means of production. In communism, you have centralized ownership of the means of production. Also, generally speaking, in socialism, you have private property. It can be to varying degrees. But generally speaking, socialist economies economically are thought of as market economies, while as communist economies, we think of these as command economies that often feature no private property or limitations on private property ownership. So you can kind of read up on what we call these Onist and Icarian movements to the Midwest of America in the 1800s. Generally speaking, these movements were not very successful. It came apart for a number of reasons: corruption, unrest, breaking into factions about how the communities should be managed. And so again, the main takeaway that here is we want to understand the underlying theory and the difference between socialism and communism and how those two differ from capitalism. It's also somewhat useful to study just some of our previous revolutionary movements, maybe of the 1900s, and study to what degree those were aimed at socialism, what degree they were aimed at command economies, and what the actual result of them was. All right, so moving on to kind of our more reformists rather than people who wanted to restart, break free, and create a communal economy or a socialist economy without class structure. We have Jeremy Bentham, again, responsible for many of the writings that we saw on that first page, the philosophic radical methods and theories. He's also most notable for what we call his principle of utility. To Bentham, you can figure out the mathematical value of an action or choice by adding up all the sum of the pleasure and all of the pain. Pleasure minus pain gives you the utility of an action. So in the Bentham reading that I assigned to you, Bentham covers kind of what goes into pleasure and what goes into pain and how you can calculate it. You won't be directly tested on what goes into pleasure and pain, but in general, you should know that while this thought of what makes us happy and how happy it makes us wasn't especially new, Jeremy Bentham is kind of one of the first people to mathematize it, write down how you can make this into a calculation. We also talk about Jeremy Bentham and his views on usury, meaning taxation. So remember Bentham here, he's alive, born in 1748, probably starts writing sometime around 1770. At this point, the church is still a major social influence, and the church viewed matters of finance and lending as impure. So as a result, many classical economists viewed interest as theft, and there was some debate about whether kind of central banks should exist. Bentham says that, yeah, it's true that banks don't necessarily always act in the way that we want them to. Maybe they'll lend too much, cause a little bit of inflation. But without banks, individuals are going to resort to riskier forms of borrowing or stealing in order to get money to finance their individual projects. So Bentham is kind of pro-banks, pro-usury. And at the end of this discussion, really, we kind of move into a period of time where we're not really questioning whether banks are charging interest are good or bad anymore. We sort of economically accept that as a feature. People need to take out loans in order to innovate. Right. Another of the philosophic radicals kind of later on, John Stuart Mill, the son of James Mill, who was a friend and colleague of Bentham. Mill is generally known more as a philosopher than an economist, but his philosophy in general is applicable to kind of the economic writings of the time. So first, we see Mill on what we call his critical methodology. And Mill believed that economics as a science or studies of the world in general should take on what he calls an a priori approach, which means that you essentially start with mathematics or theories. You start with a set of valid assumptions and you derive conclusions from these valid assumptions. Then what you can do is check whether the conclusions derived from these valid assumptions match up with real world empirical or anecdotal evidence. What you don't want to do is start with only anecdotal or empirical evidence and try to create a theory based on only that evidence. Mill believes you have to start with some sort of mathematical or logical approach which is removed from the evidence and derive results which can explain that evidence. Perhaps more notably, Mill is known for his harm principle, which essentially says here that the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. It doesn't seem like Mill specifically rules out harm to oneself, but he does break down harm into two categories, which are physical harm or psychological financial harm. And so there is some debate. Critics of Mill's harm principle argue that Mill isn't exactly very specific with what exactly harm is and how much harm should be prevented, or to what degree, if you're causing harm, you should no longer do an action. Mill's harm principle can essentially be interpreted to say that an action can be justified morally so long as, compared to its alternatives, it minimizes the amount of harm done to others. From that, what we get, I have it on an additional slide, but I'll just talk about it here. We get this idea out of kind of both Bentham and Mill of the government and the role of government that we call the greatest good principle, which is that governments should aim to enact policies which result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And this is going to be measured kind of with this utility concept, right? If you're thinking of government action, you want to measure up all the good it'll cause, measure up the harm, subtract the harm from the good and pick the policy which results in kind of the highest overall utility. Right. Finally, we talk about Mill and his discussion of the steady state. Remember, to our previous economists, the steady state was something that we should avoid. And Adam Smith, a stationary or steady state meant that we were done with division of labor, we were done with economic growth. In Malthus and Ricardo, the land use model, once we get to the steady state, we're done growing, and that's kind of bad. Ricardo provide some ways via international trade or innovation that we might be able to avoid the steady state. Mill actually describes the steady state as being something that could be not so bad. Mill views all of the competition and economic growth as being kind of hard on some people in the competition. So Mill believes that if it's possible that we eventually get to this steady state where population is done growing and we sort of have the rate of production that we need, we don't need to focus on growth and producing more, that could actually be a good thing. In order for it to be a good thing, though, you need to have some sort of upward pressure on wages via these kind of social reforms that the philosophic radicals are advocating. Right, so Mill, kind of our first author that views a possible steady state or an end of perpetual economic growth as possibly not such a bad thing, where our previous authors have viewed that kind of maximum quantity where the land becomes less valuable than workers' wages as a place that we do not want to get to because that's the end of economic growth. Right, just a couple kind of wrap-ups, summaries here. So the role of government in classic literature, we started with our early economists and writers who are talking about essentially the government as being there to command militaries. And then later we see Hume, Locke, and Petty, who say, yeah, we want to command the militaries, advance the interests of the state, but also there to settle private property disputes. So we see kind of this conception as the government with regard to private property. And then here through the physiocrats and Smith, we see a focus on agricultural development. We need to feed workers to be able to specialize, so we need more agriculture. The role of government is to promote agricultural growth, delay the onset of the steady state by engaging in trade and specialization to make sure we don't get that quantity max in Malthus and Ricardo's land use model, or the theory of rent model, the corn model in Ricardo. Here in Mill, we see that the job of the government is to enact policies which result in the greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of utility. And we talked briefly about our socialist utopians who viewed the government as an agency that should act as an altruistic arbiter of resources. Right, we see this discussion of the steady state that I mentioned in Mill. Here in Malthus and Ricardo, you eventually get to the end of growth, and that's bad. Possible maybe in Ricardo, and then we'll see it moving forward in the neoclassical literature. That's all about expanding your production possibilities frontier and creating economic growth that way. So here we see the expansion of the PPF. Mill says maybe we do get to the steady state eventually, but there could be some upward pressure on wages for the working class at or near that steady state, which could be good, especially if the government is willing to step in and provide education and good quality public services. Right, so that's the end of Module 1. I've listed some critiques of the classical theory here. Just kind of for your information. These aren't necessarily tested on, but classical theory focuses on the relationship between groups, but we don't really focus much on how those groups formed. Not much discussion of equity and justice and things like that. So that's it for Module 1. Let me know if you have any questions. The video that will follow this will review the topic list for our first reading quiz.